everybody. We are here today to talk about cueing skillfully. We've been getting a good amount of questions from students in our Facebook group, on Instagram, inside of our trainings, just about cues and how they play into being a yoga teacher. And it's something we are both very passionate about. And we figured we'd hop on and chat a little bit about some of the tips that we have for being able to cue your classes well. Patrick and I are extremely passionate about yoga sequencing. I think that's something that we feel is hugely important in terms of overall success of students in a class, thus also creating success for teachers to be able to build their classes. Once you learn to sequence really well, I think that's a huge piece of being able to grow as a yoga teacher. But I would also say that's like 50% of the puzzle. You can put together an excellent yoga sequence, but if you can't lead anybody through it with really solid cues, then it doesn't really matter how good your sequence is on paper. Do you agree with that, Patrick?
Yeah, because the execution and how it's delivered is, equally as important as the plan itself. So I totally agree with that.
So I think when it comes to cueing, that's something we've both worked at refining over the years to try. I know I've done personally, that was something I focus on, especially early in my teaching career, on getting more specific and exact with cues. And I know we even get questions frequently about should I use my notes when I'm teaching a class? It's hard to remember, right, my sequence. And I think part of what we feel, it's not bad if you do, but I think what separates good yoga teachers from really great ones is the ability to start to move away from using your notes and leaning into your cues, being present in the room, and being able to really refine them in a way that works effectively to lead your students through a class. So I'm excited to talk about this today.
Definitely. So what do you think, Kate, as far as if you're going to kick it off, what do you think is the most important, or at least the first step when you think about cueing for, I guess, new teachers or teachers who are trying to refine their teaching?
So I think probably the biggest and first step that I have, and that I think people make the biggest mistake about, is I think cues should be as simple as possible. Learning to simplify your language and simplify your cues, I think, is key to be able to doing them skillfully and successfully. I think for a long time, and it exists all over the place, there's a lot of, I hate to say this, but I think sometimes there are yoga teachers who I think it feels more like a performance, where they need to bring in all this flowery language and make this whole poetic experience out of a class. And while that can feel nice, a lot of times I have found that I'm okay, I'm taking this class and I understand you're talking about all these things that I should feel and the flowers and the sunshine, but also what should I be doing with my hands and feet? What do you want me to actually do? And I think simplifying your cues is step one, and not feeling like you need to overcomplicate and share every alignment point and every single thing about a pose. Really, people just want to know what they need to do with their hands and with their feet to move from point A to point B. And I think that's the first step. What about you?
Yeah, I think one of my teachers recently said, especially for beginners, instructing them from almost exactly what you're saying, from the arms and the legs. If you get your students' arms and legs in the right position, 90% of the alignment is going to be in the right spot. And even talking about the spine and the pelvis initially it's too complicated. Stick with the arms and the legs, straighten the arms, bend the arms, straighten the legs, bend the legs, hands and feet, same thing. And you'll get students pretty far in the right direction before you start to add in some more complex pieces of information. And to your point about the flowery language, my first teacher training, we had exercises where we wrote out what's happening with the pose action-wise, and then we had to write out flower language to describe those physical actions, which I just forgot about that until you were just mentioning it now. And how I've very much so moved away from that language, because that poetic language, although is sometimes nice, and it means different things to different people, and it doesn't really tell someone's body how to move in a specific direction quite often, or people can interpret what you're saying differently on how they should move their body than what you actually mean.
Yeah.
So I've really moved towards more action oriented language to get people to do something in their body and feel something in their body.
Yeah. I like to think of it in almost like, to me, I've broken it into two different categories. I think there's action focused cues and then experiential cues. And I think every class starts with the action focused ones. So moving people through your sequence, the cues should all be action focused. So like start with an action word, then tell them what to do with their body part, namely their arm or their leg, right? Like step your foot forward, straighten your right leg, like just step, straighten, balance, bring, bend. Yeah, like keeping that action word, then telling them what to do with their hands or their feet, get them in the pose. And I think also naming the pose, right? Like straighten your front leg, reach your right arm forward, bring it down to your ankle, triangle pose. And now you've like given them 3 steps, 3 actions to put their body into triangle pose. Once you do those action cues to get them there, then I like to think about experiential cues. And again, still not super flowery language, but once they're in a pose, then it's about like, what should they feel, right? Or like the little nuances that you can change, like feel your ribs lengthen, take a breath in, and then like pull your belly button in and up. Things that you can do once you're in the pose, I think can heighten the experience. But I also think that should be reserved more for intermediate to advanced students. I think for beginners and level 1 students, really it's just the action cues, like the experiential cues, kind of like you said. Half the time people have difficulty figuring out like their left from their right when moving through a yoga class. And then you start being like, with your sacrum, and people are like, where the heck is my sacrum? You know, like I think we overestimate, I think as yoga teachers, because we start to build body awareness and are so passionate about this practice that we forget that not everybody has that language until they've been practicing for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. I also like what you said too about just naming the pose. I know we've sat in together and then separately as well, like a lot of practice teaches for teacher trainings. And I think back to like a lot of those teachers saying like when they're going from warrior 2 to triangle, for example, they're like straighten your leg, lift your kneecap, reach your arm forward, bring your hand to the block, take your other arm up. And people are like moving like robots instead of just saying, like you said, you can say 1 or 2 things like straighten your leg, bring your hand to a block, triangle pose, because most of the people are going to have some familiarity with the pose. And if you name the pose early on, a lot of people can like more easily move into it. And then you can keep refining with the other things that you want to say about it. So I do like to say 1 or 2 things and then just name the pose, because a lot of people are going to know the general direction that you want them to go in. And that just helps it along a little bit.
Well, it's sort of like, if you think about going on like a road trip or something, right? Like if you tell someone like, okay, this is the starting point, and you're like, by the way, you're going to be, thank you. So you're going to be going, I don't know, you're going to find like, you're taking a road trip to get to Yoga Renew Studios in Hoboken. I think it's like, if you come off of the train and you're like, hey, you're going to Yoga Renew, make sure that you look out for like the big logo that says Yoga Renew. And when you come out of the train station, you're going to go straight across the street and make a right. Like, okay, they only need to know I get out of the train station. There's like 2 actions. And then really I'm just looking for the logo, versus if you're like, you don't tell them where they're going. And it just becomes this whole thing like, come out, walk up the stairs, make a right, look at the taxi cab stand. The water is going to be down. Like you don't need all of those details really if you just like say what the destination is. And I think it's similar with this. Like if you say to someone, everybody like, hey, we're going to come to extended side angle next. To do that today, bend your knee and I want you to focus on whatever. Most people know what that looks like. And maybe in like a true beginner's class, they might not. And then you obviously need more language. But I think that also goes with maybe trying to like demo a bit more or be much more specific in terms of, it feels more of a workshop versus like leading someone through some type of vinyasa flow or a hatha class where you're dealing with students who have a little bit more of that vocabulary.
Definitely.
Yeah. Are there any pet peeves that you have with cueing in terms of like stuff that you've heard people say that you're like, don't do that?
I'm definitely not as good as you at, thinking back again to like sitting in on teacher practice teaches where you pick up, extra language. My thing is,
It's the former English teacher in me.
Yeah. I really just like, I wish more teachers use Sanskrit,
Mm.
and not like English translations, especially English translations that really, I don't know how they came about because they have nothing to do with either the Sanskrit direct translation or really what's happening energetically in the pose, which if you use the Sanskrit and you can break it down, a lot of times so much more about the pose. And I
Mhm.
like to, especially early on, like I'll say, okay, extend your arm, bring your hand down, triangle pose, trikonasana. So I like to associate the English version of the
Mhm.
word with the Sanskrit, like almost always. So it just becomes second nature for me as the teacher. And then the students like pretty quickly start to pick up on that Sanskrit. So I do wish more teachers use Sanskrit. The one pet peeve though is pyramid pose like instead of calling it Parshvottanasana, because it really translates as intense side stretch, and pyramid pose, it just seems like this very short stance with the legs to create like a little pyramid. And
Yeah.
you really need a wider stance and you got to lengthen your side. So I feel like there's just
Yep.
so much more in the Sanskrit than just saying pyramid pose. So
Yeah.
if I had a pet peeve, it would be that.
And I also think this is a slight tangent, but to that point, uh, we get a lot of questions on like, how do you memorize the Sanskrit? And for me, I never like sat down with flashcards and tried really hard to memorize them. I think I just took classes often with teachers who would say a lot of the Sanskrit. And then over time, like as a student from hearing it often, you just start to develop an understanding of it. So it's also a gift, I think, that we can give to our students. Like it doesn't have to be this overly obnoxious thing where you're like driving it home. I think it's just the more that you say it, the more familiar people become with it. And I think it just layers in some of that authenticity that exists. And it's, a beautiful language and a reason that poses are named that way. So that's fun. Good
Yeah.
job, because I feel
And
like I took your classes and you said it a lot.
yeah. Also, too, Sanskrit's supposed to be, a vibrational language, and by using
Mhm.
that Sanskrit carries, vocalizing those words, carries the essence of those vocalized
Mhm.
words in the sound. So I think if you believe in that piece of it, by using Sanskrit, kind of adds more depth to the experience of taking a yoga class in general.
Yeah,
You know.
I agree. I love that. I think my pet peeves, the two that I have that come to mind are, well, okay, three. You're right. I am a little picky about language, but I think it's really important. And I will say that well, I'll get to this in a second, but the first is it drives me crazy when teachers don't speak in the present tense. And mainly it becomes like this passive ing thing where like people will say like stepping your foot forward, and then there's just like a dot dot dot, and I'm like, and then what do you want everybody to do? Or like reaching your arm up over your head, and I'm like, right, but just tell people like reach your arm up over your head, step your foot forward. Like it feels like this dot 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 and leaves, I think, like this question mark of what's coming next. And also you're in a room right now teaching people, so like speak to them in the present moment. To that point, also, like you're teaching, yes, you're teaching a group, but I also think when you're teaching, the idea is to try to personalize that experience as much as possible to each individual student. So using singular pronouns, like mainly your or you, as opposed to our and ours, I think is really helpful. So saying like step your foot forward instead of step our, or I guess your wouldn't work. Or I'm trying to think of how else people say it when they don't, like our focus today is this. That works. What am I trying to say? It's like using you though. Like I feel like sometimes people say like we, oh, that's what it is. Like we are going to do blah, blah, blah. We should move into doing this, when I think it should be like about you, like talk to the individual student as opposed to the group as a whole, unless you're literally stopping and talking to the group as a whole. But in terms of moving the body, I think it should be focused on like you and your, and taking people through it in that way so that it's personalized to them. Um,
Yeah.
and then just catching like filler words. I took a class with someone once, this many years ago, but her biggest filler word was the word beautiful. So every single time we did anything, she would literally say, come forward to plank pose, beautiful. Lower down to chaturanga, beautiful. And I was like, okay, I get it, but like I don't look that beautiful doing all of this. And I feel like that's all that I ended up hearing. And it kind of inflicted a bit on the experience. So learning, like, I know for myself, I've gone through phases where I catch them for myself. I went through this phase where I would say now for everything. Before I would cue, I would say, now do this, now do that. And I remember being like, they get it. They know it's now. Like, it's not going to happen later. So stop saying that. And I had to work hard to drop that. But it's just being mindful of the different filler words that we pick up and trying to let those go.
Yeah. I don't know any of mine. I'm sure I have a ton. But
You're not too bad. But I think
Yeah.
keeping it present, keeping it personal, and trying to weed out filler words are important as well. And the other thing is understanding that being able to master this and do it well and put focus on it, I think is really key in terms of giving yourself options as a yoga teacher. I feel very grateful that when the pandemic hit and we had to shift to teaching online, that I had already spent a lot of time really learning how to refine my cues without having to teach demoing everything and having teachers be able to see me. Because I think when you put it behind a screen, it becomes very difficult to like watch a teacher, to try to lead people through something in a digital world, depending and leaning on them actually watching you in order to go through a sequence is very difficult. And I feel like we were able to seamlessly transition to teaching online because I can sit in the corner of a room and teach a class just by talking without having to show a lot. And I feel like that comes from practice of like moving through cues.
And that also comes from the idea of really us never teaching with a yoga mat in the front of the class also,
Correct.
where we literally only use our words to guide people through a sequence. And then if we had to pause and show something visually, of course we would, but our system never really demoed the entire class where we're really using language so people have their own experience and not have to keep looking up, at the teacher. And if you do that really well, then they can listen and, use their own intelligence and experience that in their own body, in their own movement. And I agree with you that it translated to the digital pretty well.
Yeah, it translates to the digital. And I know I experienced, as you know, during both of my pregnancies, I couldn't really practice yoga physically myself anymore, just because of some of the physical limitations that it presented for me. But I was still able to teach pretty much throughout my entire pregnancy, both times, because I was able to still talk everybody through a class. And I think that came down to skillful cueing. And that's also a big thing, right? As yoga teachers, we use our bodies. God forbid you break a wrist or an ankle or are dealing with some type of physical limitation where now you can't show things physically. I think being able to have very skillful cues allows you to still work, which is hugely important.
Yeah. I think in the beginning, teachers will pick up their teachers' cues, right? They'll use the language that their teachers use. But I would just say, think about like those cues and the language that's being used and how clear it really is. And then also when you're teaching, obviously you have to be in observation mode for your students. There's sometimes I say something and I'm like, oh, that clearly didn't make sense, because no one did the thing that I was asking them to do. So really just be
for sure.
keen and aware and observing your students. And I think that by doing that, that'll help you refine your language just based on what you see your students doing. Are they understanding the concepts that you're presenting and doing what you think you're asking them to do?
Totally. Like I've been in a room where if you're present and you're paying attention to your students and like I say something and I look around and half the room is standing and half of them are still in forward fold, I'm like, okay, clearly I didn't say that very well, and I think also just understanding that like students in the room, because I think a lot of the pushback is this feeling of like, well, what if I mess up, right? What if I say something wrong? And I think it's like
all the time.
all the time. And it's like students don't expect a perfect yoga teacher. They just want a present yoga teacher. I think just the other day I did that. Like half the class was doing one thing and half was doing the other. And I was like, clearly that was a terrible cue. And I said that out loud. I was like, okay, clearly that cue didn't make any sense to anybody. Everyone stand up, like, and you just acknowledge it and fix it. And it usually makes people laugh. And I think that they actually appreciate the realness there. Having someone be present is way more important, I think, than having someone be perfect. So yeah,
absolutely.
That's the other piece. I think that's all I really wanted to, chat about though. Thanks for leading the charge there on always making us, I will say also, for anyone watching this, if the idea of not demoing your class the whole time makes you uncomfortable, know that that also used to make me really uncomfortable. When I first started teaching at a My 200 hour, it was definitely like taught, we lay the mat out at this, like at the start of class, you get on your mat. And I certainly used to do a good portion of my class. And then when Patrick and I started working together, he was like, yeah, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is super hard. And it is hard for like 2 weeks. And then you just, well, if you're teaching a ton, like it's hard the first few times to not be in front of the room, demoing. But once you break that habit, it makes everything significantly easier, even to the point of if you can teach from the back of the room, suddenly your left and your right become the same as your students. And then you don't have to worry so much with mirroring and all of that. So I
always felt,
acknowledge that that's a hard thing. That was very difficult for me at first. But I just believe in it so much, having done it both ways.
yeah, I never in my trainings, I was never allowed to demo at all. So it never was a thing for me. But I do remember taking classes in which the teacher demoed and looking up and the teacher like in downward dog and teaching, but then doing the pose and me feeling like they're in their own experience. They don't see
Yeah.
me. I always
Yeah.
felt like there was no eye contact. There was like no acknowledgement of me there. They were just doing their own practice and then talking out into space is the way I
Yeah.
felt as a student at that time. And you know, I don't know the experience from teaching that way because I never did, but I know from my experience as a student watching a teacher demo the whole class, to me, it just felt like they couldn't acknowledge me and the other students there because they were just doing their own poses
Yeah.
and then talking about them. And we were all following along, but they never saw me. And I just thought it was an odd arrangement. So when I found classes that weren't that, I felt
More.
seen and I felt like the teachers came over and spoke to me specifically about what I was doing in a pose. And it
And like
also
take care
helped
of you,
me
even from a safety
hear.
standpoint.
Yeah.
To like make sure that the students are safely moving through poses and not going to injure themselves, especially early on for beginners, right? That they're not doing a pose that's going to totally misaligned and going to hurt their shoulder or their knee or something like that. Yeah, I
Absolutely.
agree. Yeah, good point. So, well, thank you again for making the time to chat about this. We hope everyone, if you tuned in, that this is helpful. Tag us, ask us questions, and we are always happy to chat more about other topics if there's anything that's on your mind. And we'll talk to you again soon. All right. Thanks, Patrick. See ya.
Bye. See ya.